Everyone for joining us again tonight. This is the second in our series of 3 talks with Dr. Robin Nusslock of Northwestern University. In addition to being a very valued member of our Turgar community here in Chicago, Robin is an associate professor of psychology, psychiatry, and neurobiology at Northwestern University, where he serves as the director of the Affective and Clinical Neuroscience Laboratory and the Center on Social Disparities and Health. We've been having a series of conversations about the way that stress impacts us and can be carried through the generations, and also how meditation and other practices can remediate some of that. And so last month, we had a talk called The Tour of Your Emotional Brain, which many of you probably attended, but if you weren't able to see it, it's available on the Turgar Meditation Community YouTube channel. So I would warmly invite you to go check that out. And tonight, Robin will be giving a talk called How Stress Gets Under Your Skin and What You Can Do About It. My name's Amy Roth. I'm one of the practice leaders of the Turgar Chicago Meditation Group, along with Jill Boba, who's also on this call, and then Madeline and Kevin round out our team. So if you have any questions for us, you can always email chicago@turgar.org. It's TERGAR.org. And we'd be happy to answer any questions you have or let you know about any other events or happenings that we've got going on. So with no further ado, Robin.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Amy. And also special thanks to Madeline for all of your help in coordinating tonight. As Amy mentioned, this is the second part of a 3-part conversation that we're having as a group on the science of mind, emotion, health, and meditation. And as Amy alluded to, the goal of the first conversation, which happened in December, was to provide a basic introduction to the anatomy of the emotional brain, what brain regions are involved in generating our positive emotions, our challenging emotions, feelings of empathy and compassion. This event, as Amy alluded to, is posted to the internet, so it's on the Turgar Meditation Community website if you want to see it. My goal for tonight is twofold. First, I want to take what we've learned in our first conversation in December on the emotional brain and expand it to explore the following question. How is it that stress, whether it be in our personal life, in our work life, in the world more generally, how is it that stress gets underneath our skin to affect our mental and physical health and well-being? And second, I want to discuss 5 strategies that have been supported by science to help us navigate the stressors in our lives and develop what some folks refer to as resiliency. And then on Tuesday, February 9th, we'll dive more deeply into the science of change and explore how meditation, exercise, psychotherapy, etc., can change the biology of the brain and body in a bit more detail in ways that promote health and well-being. And this will talk in February will really focus a lot on the work of Richie Davidson and Cortland Dahl and others in the Turgar community. Again, you don't need to attend all these events. They're meant to stand alone. Like last time, I just want to provide a little bit of context. This event is being hosted by the Turgar Meditation Community, which is a wonderful community in Chicago and internationally, which is based on the really extraordinary teachings of Mingyur Rinpoche. And I feel very privileged to be a part of the community. I do know that we have a diverse group of people here tonight. Some individuals will have meditated for years, and others may have never been exposed to meditation. My goal is to really make this accessible to hopefully, everyone, and hopefully interesting to everyone. We will do some very brief guided meditations just to connect to some of the content from tonight, but mostly it'll be a conversation. As Amy alluded to, I'm a professor at Northwestern where I run a research laboratory that's focused on using structural and functional brain imaging to probe the emotional brain. And this content tonight emerges out of a class that I teach called The Emotional Brain at Northwestern. So here it is, a Tuesday night. We may have all had a stressful day. We may have had a great day. We may have been busy. We may have been relaxed. But in the spirit of kind of bringing ourselves into this moment, I'd like to just invite us to kind of take a breath and let your shoulders relax. And I'm going to just lead us in a very, very brief meditation about the idea of emotion and the feeling of emotion to kind of connect with some of the content that we'll be discussing today. So Just if you're able to, just you can kind of get comfortable, let your shoulders loosen, let your breath slow, close your eyes if you wish, and I'll just have you kind of just do a big exhale and take a moment to connect with yourself. If you can find your breath and have that help you bring you into the moment. And I'd like you to ask the question to yourself, how am I feeling right now? And just let whatever arise, arise. And whatever you're feeling is just okay as it is. It becomes stuff to explore tonight in our conversation. Maybe try to locate where you're feeling that feeling in the body. Is it in the chest? Is it in the shoulders? Is it dense? Is it light? We'll just take another breath or two to connect with how we're feeling, and then when you feel comfortable, you can open your eyes and reconnect with the group. So the topic and the focus of these conversations are really what's going on in the body, what's going on in the brain, what brain systems are involved in generating these feelings that we experience. And so I'm going to start to share my slides because I want to be able to show you some stuff. Okay, is everyone able to see that? Yeah. Amy, we're good? Okay. So you may recall, for those of you who attended the first talk in December, that we discussed 3 pillars of the emotional brain. And what I want to do first is I just want to provide us with a very brief reminder of the 3 pillars of the emotional brain. And also for folks who did not attend December, this kind of allows them to get caught up to speed. So for the sake of oversimplifying the emotional brain, you could consolidate the emotional brain into 3 pillars. The first pillar is related to threat processing and defense processing. The second pillar is related to positive emotion and kind of rewards and pursuits and goals. And the third is related to the part of our brain that's involved in regulating and managing and kind of navigating the world and managing our particular emotions. And what's interesting is we could also link these 3 pillars to 3 brain regions. Threat, defensive, more fearful emotions have been linked to a region of the brain called the amygdala. But we discussed in December how the amygdala is not really just a fear center, it's really like a salient center. You could think of the amygdala as like your vigilance region. And it turns out the amygdala can be activated to both positive and negative emotions. And so it's a region that's very much involved in stress, but it's also involved in positive emotions. You could think of the amygdala, before we move on to the next region, you could think of the amygdala as the brain's brake pad. One of the primary things that the amygdala does is it inhibits behavior. It stops you. If you activate the amygdala of a rodent, the first thing it does is freeze. So you could think of the freezing response as really core to the amygdala. By contrast, you could think of the ventral striatum, which is another region of the brain that we discussed, as really being involved in like the brain's gas pedal or the brain's accelerator. It's the part of the brain that's really about getting you up off the couch to go pursue the rewards that you want in your environment, whether they're food or a person or something that you need to do. This is the motivational portion of the brain that's designed to get you to go. And the third pillar of the brain that we talked about is this piece of tissue right behind our forehead, which has been referred to as the prefrontal cortex. This is just a little cartoon of just part of the prefrontal cortex. But it's really you could think of this as the part of the brain that helps you navigate space, to navigate future, to retrospect on the past. And it also is very involved in regulating our emotions and kind of talking ourselves down, talking ourselves up, or just helping us kind of stay in a current emotional state. Now, we also discussed one other theme that I want to highlight in our tour of the emotional brain in December before we get to tonight's content, which is that we're moving away from viewing the brain as a series of specific islands in which each region does distinct things separate from other regions. It turns out that every brain region really communicates with every other brain region. So this is a computer rendering of the outputs from the amygdala to the rest of the brain. And you can see that essentially the amygdala, which is this vigilance region of the brain, essentially is moderating and modulating and connecting and communicating with every other part of the brain. And so many people are moving away from kind of viewing the amygdala or the ventral striatum as just the fear region or the reward region, but really realizing that it's embedded in a network where many different parts of the brain come together to create our experience of emotion. This also creates, I think, a challenge to the fundamental distinction between thought and emotion, that you have brain regions that are just devoted to thought and brain regions that are just devoted to emotion, because the brain regions that we think are devoted to thought are intimately interconnected with the emotion regions. And the brain regions that we know are connected with emotion hugely influence our cognition. And so in current kind of neuroscience thinking, what people view consciousness as is not so much a region of the brain that does consciousness, but rather consciousness is an emergent property of all of these billions and tens of billions of neurons communicating with each other and somehow creating some unified emergent property in our mind that we experience as consciousness. Neuroscience hasn't cracked the code of how that happens, and that's what's called the hard problem in neuroscience, and that's one of the reasons why this is such an exciting field. Richie Davidson, who is a wonderful neuroscientist, a member of the Turgor community, somebody I trained with at the University of Wisconsin, has a quote that he would often say. He said that there's no organ in the body that's more designed to change in response to experience than the brain. And I think that's very true. And this introduces a concept that will be important for tonight and also our conversation in February of neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is just saying that the brain changes in response to experience. But what's interesting is it's saying that it's what the current research is also saying is that it's agnostic to direction. And what I mean by that is if people engage in unhealthy kind of ruminative, destructive behavior, you're going to have neuroplastic changes in your brain. They're just going to be more destructive neuroplastic changes. And we know that addiction, for example, is fundamentally a condition of neuroplasticity. People take substances to the point where the brain gets hijacked and literally has a down regulation of receptors in the brain where it needs that substance just to feel normal. That's neuroplasticity. But similarly, if you engage in coming to Sunday morning Turgor practices and engage in mindfulness meditation or exercise or prayer or learning and things that we'll talk about tonight, those are also associated with neuroplastic changes that are more positive direction. So as I mentioned earlier, I really have two goals for tonight. The first goal is I want to explore as a group the current thinking on stress biology and how is it that stress in our environment gets underneath our skin to affect our brains and bodies in ways that puts us at risk for both mental and physical problems. But I also want to complement that with spending about the same amount of time focusing on the idea of resiliency, which is the idea that we can engage in lifestyle choices. We can engage in kind of, training exercise. We can train our mind and brain and bodies to be optimally resilient, optimally adaptive in navigating stress over the course of our lives. So just to dive into the first part, again, the core theme of this particular first part is answering the following question: how is it that stress gets underneath the skin to affect our body and brain? And I actually, kind of in the spirit of this, just want to pause for a second And I just want to actually have us kind of engage with this in a more personal way. And I'd ask you to, if you want, close your eyes or keep your eyes open. I'm just going to ask you to bring your attention to a stressful moment or a stressful experience in your life. Please don't choose the most stressful thing in your life at the moment. Just choose something maybe that stressed you out today, a call with a colleague, a telemarketer, or something that just kind of got you activated, and just take a moment and feel what that feels like in your body and in your brain. Okay, so does anyone want to take a stab at what you felt? Amy, what did you feel?
I felt a little bit of constriction in like down in my belly, and then I noticed like old narratives getting churned up.
Mhm. Wonderful. Anyone else have anything that they want to share about feelings that they had? David.
Hi, and thanks all so much. A lot of feel there's a lot of activation often for me with in my head area, my face, my neck, my shoulders, and just below those to my upper chest. Thank you.
Wonderful. I think both, what both Amy and David point out is the idea that there's a cognitive component to stress, but there's also a body component to stress. And that's really what I want to focus on today, is both the cognitive or emotional component to stress, but also the body component to stress. And so what I want to emphasize is that stress, when done or dealt with adaptively or in small doses, can be very adaptive. If you think about the immune system actually needs a certain amount of stress in order to learn. I would say that the brain needs a certain amount of stress in order to learn. So that, stress kind of becomes our teacher in many respects. It becomes a part of our repertoire of learning how to respond to things. And I think, Mingyur Rinpoche and the teachings of Turgar do a wonderful job of emphasizing this. But there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that chronic stress can be very negative and hurtful for the body. And so when I'm talking about stress here, I'm going to be particularly focusing about chronic stress and about how chronic stress gets underneath the skin to really embed itself in our biology. And this is based on a recent paper that my colleague Greg Miller, who runs an immunology lab at Northwestern, and I wrote, really examining the questions of how is it that stress gets underneath the skin to affect our body. And what I'm going to be focusing on today is providing a very introductory overview of signaling between the brain and the body, and in particularly the brain and the immune system, to understand the mechanisms by which stress embeds itself in our bodies. And then again, at the end, providing you with strategies for navigating stress in a more adaptive way so that this doesn't hook us as much. A couple of thoughts that you may be having. One is that there's some evidence to suggest that early life adversity, particularly the first 6 months to 2 years of life, appears to be a very important time period for establishing the biological set point in our brains and bodies. But I, at the same time, would emphasize that chronic stress at any point in our lives is going to have an important effect. So whether it's early, mid, or late, it will apply for our conversation today. There's some research to suggest that different types of stressors have different types of effects on the brain. This is really being spearheaded these days by Katie McLaughlin, who's a professor at Harvard, who suggests that you can dissociate stress into threat and deprivation. Threat is more associated with kind of the activation of vigilance processes in the brain, and deprivation is more associated with kind of the absence of certain things. But I would say that in the body, there's growing evidence to suggest that all stress is created equal, that many different types of stress actually have comparable effects on the body. Now I'm not trying to gloss over very serious threat versus minor stress, trauma, et cetera. But if you're just talking about different domains of stress, personal, professional, global. It's going to affect the body in comparable ways. And I'll try to make clear why that's the case. And finally, I just want to acknowledge that we're all living through an extraordinarily stressful time at the moment with Corona. And I'll kind of at the end tie together social relationships in ways that we can actually maximize our well-being, even in the midst of COVID, through social relationships. So this is a complex figure, but I want to try to make it very simple. So what I want to do at the beginning here is actually walk you through the figure from our paper to kind of explore to you how stress can actually get underneath the skin. And the first stop in our tour of the question of how stress gets underneath the skin is the amygdala. Now, again, we've just learned that the amygdala is really the brain's fire alarm. It's the brain's vigilance system. It's a part of the brain that's very much involved in, in vigilance and also fear, anxiety, and various conditions. And what we do know is the fact that stress really sensitizes the amygdala. It increases the function of the amygdala, and it actually alters the structure of the amygdala. And this is, you can observe this from rodents to primates to humans, that chronic stress has functional and structural alterations to the amygdala. Now, this next figure is a little bit more complicated, but I think it's a really important point. So I'll walk you through it slowly. This is a wonderful study by Seth Pollack at the University of Wisconsin, who's done some really wonderful research on trauma in the brain. And what Seth did is he had people come in and he had them look at faces, but what he did is he pixelated the faces. So he started off, and hopefully you can see my cursor, he started off where the faces were rather pixelated and the person had a hard time seeing what facial expression was happening. But over time, what happened is that the faces got progressively more clear, and then the faces emerged to give a particular facial expression. And what Seth asked is he asked participants to push a button when they could determine what the particular facial expression that a person was conveying was. And what you find here is that, well, then what Seth did is he brought individuals in who had a history of abuse growing up, and then he had a comparison group of individuals who had no history of abuse. What we find here is that there's no dissociation between the red line and the blue line for happy faces. People with a history of abuse versus people without a history of abuse had no differences in their ability to detect happy faces. But what you find for angry faces is that people with a history of abuse were actually faster at determining when the angry faces were, because this suggests that if you're growing up in an abusive household, you need to become hyper vigilant and hypersensitive to threat cues. And this is embedded in the alteration of the amygdala in terms of its structure and function, suggesting that there's an adaptiveness that happens when we're living in stress, kind of monitoring the environment, but that has also costs in terms of affecting the amygdala and its structure and function. What's interesting is that there's also evidence to suggest that living in chronic stress has a big effect on our immune system. And the immune system is a very complicated organ, but I'm going to try to make it very simple for tonight. And I'm going to focus on one component of the immune system, which is inflammation. So if you have some exposure to immunology, you might have heard of pro-inflammatory cytokines or macrophages and various other things. I'm going to just talk about this in the context of inflammation, because it appears that inflammation is what's really important for mental and physical health. So what is inflammation? Well, inflammation is one of our first responses of the immune system to irritation or infection. Now, inflammation is stimulated by a host of molecules. You may have heard these terms, pro-inflammatory cytokines. We're hearing a lot about cytokines in COVID. It turns out that kind of a cytokine explosion is one of the things that really drive people into a negative condition with COVID. You could think of cytokines as essentially like messengers. They're designed to facilitate pro-inflammatory responses in the body that then come and facilitate tissue repair and clear pathogens and various things like that. Inflammation obviously is hugely adaptive when regulated. We would all be dead without inflammation in a functioning immune system. But there's compelling evidence to suggest that when inflammation is chronic, it actually becomes very negative for the brain and body. And chronic inflammation has been associated with a host of health problems. So in children, inflammation has been associated with asthma and respiratory infection. In adolescents, it's been associated with the onset of certain metabolic conditions like insulin resistance and very early atherosclerosis, which is the precursor for heart attacks in older adults. It's in middle and later adulthood, it's associated with metabolic syndrome, strokes, coronary heart disease, autoimmune conditions, etc. Now, the linkage between inflammation and stress is that stress we know increases inflammation. So we have this scenario where inflammation when chronic is bad, and we also know that stress is increasing inflammation. How does stress increase inflammation? That's the critical question that I want to explore right now. So there's two mechanisms, and if you're interested in mind-body medicine, I'm going to do my best to summarize all of mind-body medicine for you in about 3 minutes. The primary pathway by which stress in the brain affects the body in the periphery in terms of increasing inflammation, increasing blood pressure, etc., is through part of the nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system. You could think of the sympathetic nervous system as your fight-flight system. So when I had you reflect on what it felt like to be stressed, maybe you felt your heart rate increase, you felt blood pressure increasing, you maybe felt you're kind of flushed in the face. That's all because your sympathetic nervous system is engaging and activating and preparing you to fight, to flight, or to freeze. It's the primary kind of defensive mechanism by which the brain communicates with the body. Why does this relate to inflammation? What's so fascinating is that the sympathetic nervous system enters into organs where immune cells mature. The bone marrow, the thymus, the spleen, and it secretes a little molecule onto developing immune cells called norepinephrine is the molecule it secretes onto it. And that, lo and behold, creates an increased state of inflammation in the body. Because if the brain is in a state of defense, it wants the body to be in a state of defense. And so it's literally saying, all right, body, let's engage here. Let's ramp up our inflammatory signaling and prepare for a wound. Now, in our evolutionary history, we were running away from lions and tigers and bears. But these days we're dealing with 401ks, or we're dealing with putting food on the table, or we're dealing with our children, or we're dealing with, getting laid off at our job. I mean, all of those activate the same stress biology as running away from a lion and a bear or a tiger. So this is this first pathway. You can see it right here. It's the sympathetic nervous system. It literally enters into and intersects onto developing immune cells and releases stress hormones onto those developing immune cells. Another pathway that I'm not going to focus too much on just for simplicity, but you probably have heard of the hormone cortisol. And cortisol is a hormone that really also is involved in regulating the immune system. And where cortisol seems to be really important is helping the immune system turn on and turn off. So we really now know, and you now know, I mean, this is kind of summing up much of mind-body medicine. I mean, I grew up in the 90s where all I heard about was mind-body medicine. Mind-body medicine fundamentally is about the brain modulating the body through the sympathetic nervous system and kind of stress-related biological pathways. So if you go out and buy a handbook on mind-body medicine, it's going to be a lot of different ways of saying what I've just said now. Any questions about that? Any thoughts, concerns, or comments? And please interrupt me at any point if anything's unclear, if you have any questions, etc. Nope. Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
Because I'm kind of a nerd about this stuff.
Hi, Lisa.
So I'm curious if positive stress also increases norepinephrine levels and inflammation, or is that balanced out by like endorphins and other hormones so it doesn't have such a negative impact on inflammation?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Lisa's question is saying, well, I've just focused on the, kind of the negative emotional brain, that activates inflammatory responses. There's a couple ways to think about your question. First of all, a more relaxed, kind of content, peaceful state of being will activate another part of this nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that's really designed to kind of get us anxious and initiate freezing and fighting and fleeing behavior. The parasympathetic nervous system is referred to as the rest and digest system. So the parasympathetic nervous system is the nervous system that's it's part of the nervous system that's about relaxation. And there's evidence that relaxation, meditation, reducing our stress response is really associated with good outcomes in the immune system. So if you're thinking about the immune system from a kind of a relaxed contentment perspective, the immune system is positively affected by that, and you typically have a reduction in inflammation. But if you think of going for a goal, let's say you want to go for a goal and you're pursuing a goal and you're going for it, that positive emotional state may be slightly different. And there's new research coming out by a woman named Aisha Rolls, who's in Israel, suggesting that if you activate brain regions that are about pursuing rewards and goals, you actually get an increase in inflammation. And that is actually modulated by your reward brain regions. And so one of the thoughts is that if you're chronically striving for goals and you're never resting or digesting, you could have some negative effects on your immune system.
Interesting. Thank you.
Wonderful question. Any other questions? Yeah, Mary.
Yeah, I was wondering if there is a similar effect if like trauma is repressed and the subject is not consciously aware of it.
Yeah, it's a great question. The idea of, so there's suppression where you're trying to push it down, and then there's suppression where you may have fully suppressed it. The act of suppressing and pushing down has actually been shown to be more negative for the peripheral biological system than actually learning how to kind of navigate it and manage it. So there's compelling evidence that suppression as an emotion regulation strategy actually has negative effects on stress biology that we're talking about. In terms of whether you never actually recall the memory, I don't know about that, but I will say is that there's growing evidence to suggest that most of the mind is unconscious. I mean, there's a lot of things Freud had wrong, but he was right about that idea. He may have been wrong about the nature of the unconscious, or he may have been right. These are complex topics, but a lot of the mind is unconscious. And what we experience as consciousness is a little hiccup. It would be like just seeing the kind of end product of 100 billion neurons doing their thing. And so there is a lot of evidence that unconscious processes do affect our well-being. For example, we can show you a stimulus so fast that your brain doesn't consciously recognize that you're seeing it, but we can activate your peripheral stress biology. So there's a lot of kind of pre-conscious stuff happening. Just to kind of move on now, what's particularly interesting, and I think this relates to a conversation we had in our Turgor group a couple weeks ago, is that there's not only evidence that the brain affects the body, but there's growing evidence that the body can affect the brain. And this is kind of a little bit more recent work that's coming out. So what's intriguing is that there's growing evidence that these pro-inflammatory molecules, particularly pro-inflammatory cytokines, can access the actual core of the brain and affect the signaling of the brain. There's many ways that this can happen. I won't go into the biology of it, but many kind of levels of research across multiple levels of analysis have shown that peripheral immune signals in the body can access the brain and affect the very brain systems that we care about in emotion. So in particular, it can affect the reward regions. This is the ventral striatum, and it can affect the prefrontal cortex. Let's spend a moment exploring how this happens. What's interesting is inflammation appears to actually increase threat processing in the brain. And this makes sense, right? Because if the body's in a state of defense, it wants the brain to be in a state of defense. So it seems that the brain's defense system and the body's defense system coordinate with each other to kind of create this real kind of systemic response. So inflammation in the body can actually accentuate threat processing in the brain. What's interesting is that inflammation in the body, when it accesses the brain, it appears to lower reward processing. Now you may say, well, that's weird. Well, think about one of the times you've been sick, those early days of being sick. Maybe the first symptoms of being sick is not so much a feeling of actually a sore throat. Maybe you feel a sense of malaise. Maybe you feel a sense of kind of disengagement with the world. It turns out that the inflammation in the body actually accesses your brain's reward regions and reduces reward processing. It actually reduces dopamine transmission in the brain. Again, highly adaptive when regulated, right? Because you want to stay on the couch and heal when you're fighting a wound or you're fighting off of a pathogen. But when it's chronic, it can lead to a number of problems that we'll discuss in a moment. And finally, there's evidence that inflammation actually reduces your brain's ability to kind of regulate your emotions. Now, again, all of this is highly adaptive when it's in the short term, but when it's chronic, if you can imagine having a chronic state of inflammation, whether it's produced by stress, maybe it's produced by an autoimmune illness, it actually creates a neural profile that looks very like depression, right? Depression is characterized by high threat, low reward, and low kind of capacity of the prefrontal cortex to regulate itself. And so really what we're dealing here with is that inflammation in the body is creating a state of dysphoria in the brain. And this is maybe why one of the reasons why people with certain autoimmune illnesses, celiac, Crohn's, lupus, etc., often have struggles with certain emotional states. Let me just give you a proof of concept of this. You may say, well, that seems like kind of science fiction or maybe new age kind of wooey stuff. Well, there's actually been some pretty cool research to explore this. Let's say we brought you into a laboratory and we injected you with an endotoxin. And this has actually been done by Tristan Inagaki at Pittsburgh and Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA. We give you lipopolysaccharide, which is basically a molecule on the surface of bacteria. It doesn't make you sick, but it increases inflammation in your body. So let's say we gave you an injection of lipopolysaccharide, which is just enough to create a heightened state of inflammation. Let's say we put you into an MRI scanner and we had you look at, say, scary photographs while you're actually in an MRI scanner after you've been injected with this particular toxin. What we find is that the people in the toxin group actually show increased amygdala activation to the threatening face. Similarly, they show decreased ventral striatal activation to rewards, suggesting that inflammation in the body can causally alter our brains. And we have this very elegant and intimate connection between our brains and bodies that when adaptive, when regulated, is hugely adaptive, but can be problematic when chronic. So the last point I want to talk about is how stress gets under the skin, and then we'll transition our talk and we'll discuss about how do we navigate stress in a successful way. So we're not emphasizing stress under the skin and we're emphasizing kind of a sense of health and well-being. Is when the brain is in a state of dysphoria, what does it do? It tries to regulate that dysphoria. It tries to regulate those negative emotions. It tries to manage its stress. Now, sometimes the brain will, get up on a Sunday morning and come to the Turgot group and meditate and relax or go out for a run or do something pro-social. But a lot of times when we're stressed, we, search for donuts or we search for whiskey or we search for drugs. And what happens here is that all of these behaviors that we use to manage our own stress are actually pro-inflammatory. They further enhance inflammation. And so what happens here is that we propose that the brain and the body get stuck in this kind of positive feedback loop between negative emotions in the brain, driving stress responses in the body, enhancing this kind of negative state in the brain. Then we add kerosene under the fire and we go out and engage in drinking or eating or other things. And we kind of create this kind of positive circle between the brain and the body. And all of this, again, we view as a way of understanding how it is that stress actually embeds itself in our bodies in a way that creates risk for mental problems and physical problems. So that is a tour of how stress gets underneath the skin. I'm going to switch to resiliency, but before I do, I just want to see if anyone has any questions about this idea of how stress gets underneath the skin or about anything that I've talked about. Okay, no questions? Okay. So now let's kind of switch it around a little bit and see if we can go from like, oh, wow, what a downer. Now I understand all about how stress gets under the skin, and flip it a little bit and understand a little bit about how we can work with stress in a way that's more healthy and adaptive. So what I want to do in the second half of my talk tonight, in our conversation tonight, is provide what I would refer to as a roadmap to resiliency and really draw on research on well-being and prosociality and health and stress and various things like that, and say, what are some strategies that we know of that really help us navigate stress and mitigate the effect of stress on our body and brain? And so I'm going to put forward 5 strategies. Obviously, there are many other strategies. For example, we know sleep is really important. We know other things are very important. but for brevity and kind of simplicity, I'm going to focus on 5. So the first is I'm going to discuss very briefly tonight some research on meditation in the brain and relaxation in the brain. And then again, our conversation on February 12th will really do a deeper dive into the neuroscience of change via meditation. The next resiliency roadmap is growing evidence that social isolation, and I'm not talking necessarily about physical isolation, which is relevant for COVID. I'm talking about psychological isolation, is very, very painful and very, very difficult for our bodies and brains. And so we'll talk about how the importance of social relationships. We'll talk about exercise and some of the research on exercise and facilitating growth of new neurons in the hippocampus, which is an area of the brain that's involved in memory, and how kind of exercise can facilitate the development of good responses to stress and also healthy aging. I pull this work, Discover, from Sanjay Gupta's new book on the brain. He wrote a wonderful book that just came out, I think, last week, on ways of keeping your brain healthy as you age. He uses the word discover. I initially used the word continual learning, but the idea is that we'll actually discuss some of the research on the importance of learning for brain health. And then I'd like to finish our conversation on a core theme of Tibetan Buddhism, which is compassion and warmth, and the really important effects that warmth appears to have, both on pro-social behavior out in the world, but also on our own biology. So in the spirit of this being a Turgar conversation, I'd like to do one last kind of brief guided meditation. So the previous meditation was thinking about a stressful thing in our day. What I'd like to do now is to just have you take a moment and think about kind of the feeling of that stress washing away, the stress feeling under control, or being okay with it not being under control. And just letting yourself kind of take a moment now again to really enter into the deeper relaxation phase of our conversation tonight, and just take a moment and kind of let that stress go. And you can just feel the weight of the stress, the tension of the stress, the urgency of the stress, letting go of its grip on you and saying, for the next minute, I'm going to just take a break from it and let it just be as it is and not try to control it. Okay. So when you're able to, you can open up your eyes. And we talked about that sympathetic nervous system being associated with the stress response. And my sense is you may have been able to activate the parasympathetic nervous system a little bit now and engage in a bit of rest and digest. And so the first stop on our roadmap to resiliency is really highlighting the importance of turning down that stress response via meditation, via relaxation, via something that allows you to give your body and brain a break from the sympathetic grip that we have, or the amygdala hijack, or the amygdala grip, whatever term you kind of capture to, the idea that, at least I, from personal experience, spend a lot of time in my day in the grip, and the importance of letting go of that grip and kind of giving our stress response a break. So, if we think about the teachings of Mingyur Rinpoche, who's just a wonderful, amazing teacher, Mingyur Rinpoche has been really engaged in such a rich conversation about the intersection of science and meditation with his conversations with Richie Davidson and others. Again, the focus of our conversation on February 12th will be to do a deeper dive into the neuroscience and genomics and biology of meditation. But I just want to provide a few summary points for today. For example, we know that a very kind of brief introduction to stress relaxation and meditation really helps reduce the amygdala hijack, both functionally and structurally in our brains. And so there's evidence to suggest that learning how to relax, learning how to meditate, learning how to kind of turn off that kind of fire alarm in our brains really is associated with neuroplastic changes in the amygdala. Again, we talked about how the amygdala can be hijacked by donuts and whiskey and stress and all these things, but also the amygdala can be really positively affected by engaging in things like meditation and relaxation. Similarly, we know that relaxation, meditation, whatever it is that kind of allows that sympathetic grip to release that sympathetic hold to release its grip is associated with increased positive emotions and alterations in the function and structure of brain regions like the ventral striatum, as well as what's particularly helpful, I think, with techniques like meditation is that it can increase that pause between the stimulus and the response, right? So, instead of mindlessly reaching for the donut, mindlessly reaching for the whiskey, mindlessly reaching for, the high fat food or something, we can create a little bit of a space. Viktor Frankl talks about this, the kind of space between a stimulus and a response is our freedom. That's where we get this sense of kind of freedom to make our own choices. The mechanism that really drives that freedom is the prefrontal cortex learning how to just pause and just be with the difficult emotions long enough so that we don't kind of habitually and preconsciously go off and pursue the unconscious unhealthy behaviors. And so what's interesting here is that there's evidence that you don't need to go become a monastic in a monastery to have the positive effects of meditation. There's been research to suggest that an 8-week meditation course has robust and sustainable effects on the brain and the body. Richie Davidson did a wonderful study where he showed that a 1-day relaxation workshop actually altered gene expression in genes that are involved in turning on and turning off inflammation. So very kind of, small amounts of training will have effects on our biology. But again, I think of this as like, a muscle. I mean, I can go to the gym and work out for 5 minutes and increase my muscle strength, but if I don't do it for another year, it's going to go right back to where it is. So this is really about kind of working on habit-related behavior. I also just want to mention that, for me, at least my journey into meditation has a lot of unmeasurables about it. I mean, I'm a scientist. I love to measure things. I love to understand how the brain and body works. But there's also a point for me where it's like, it's not really about data. It's not about just increasing my amygdala or decreasing my prefrontal cortex. It's actually just about the kind of journey of self-investigation, self-exploration, spiritual investigation. And so I think that's also, for me personally, I just wanted to kind of mention that. There's a wonderful paper that just came out by Cortland Dahl, who's one of the founders of Tergar, as well as with Richie Davidson, on the proceedings of the National Academy of Science, where they discuss a training-based framework for cultivating human flourishing, where they summarize a lot of what I've talked about. And I would direct you to Richie's Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin if you're interested in getting more information on the effect of meditation on the brain. And again, in February, I'll really devote my whole talk to diving deeper into this work. So this next part of what I want to discuss is actually the importance of relationships and the importance of social relationships on health. There's some really interesting research by Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA, where she's actually suggested that the feeling of social isolation activates and stimulates brain regions that are very similar to brain regions that are involved in pain, physical pain. And there's a lot of debate about the nuances of this in the field of neuroscience that I'm not going to go into, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that emotional pain hurts just like physical pain. And in many respects, emotional pain can be more hurtful to our health and well-being in many respects than physical pain. If you want a wonderful book that just summarizes this work beautifully, I would highly encourage you to read John Cacioppo's book, Loneliness. John sadly passed away 2 years ago, but he was a professor at the University of Chicago, and just a tour de force on really understanding and examining the effect of psychological states on health. And what John summarizes in this book is that loneliness is associated with increased stress hormones like cortisol. It's associated with increased cardiac health, inflammation, sleep disruption, and depression. And obviously this is hyper relevant for us all now as we're living in the midst of a pandemic. But I would like to make one point at the end of this connection portion of our talk, which is that what John and others suggest is that the number of friends and physical proximity to friends is not nearly as important as the psychological sense of having close friends. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So just to kind of make the point about how important loneliness is, and this is a little bit of a morbid slide, but they've done research on the odds ratios of dying early. And air pollution creates a 5% increase of dying early. Obesity is quite bad, creates a 20% increase of dying early. Excessive drinking creates a 30% likelihood of dying early. And loneliness appears to be one of the single biggest predictors of mortality in terms of as people age into more senior years, is a sense of kind of real of psychological isolation. What's intriguing is that the world's strangely becoming more lonely over time. So they've done some really interesting research where they've mapped the number of people who are living in single households in the United States. And so of 1940, what you can see here is that less than 15% of the population, for the most respect, lived in a single household. These were adults. But as we kind of move throughout time, what we find is that more and more people are actually living alone. So as if we think about the 1970s, many states have 20 to 25% living alone. And as we approach 2000, the majority of states have more than 25% of people who are living in single household. And what we also find is that 20% of people reported feeling psychologically lonely in the 1980s, whereas 40% of people were reporting being lonely in 2017. So there was this wonderful study done called the Harvard Study of Adult Development, in which they tracked people from basically, these were World War II generation individuals, 1940s, actually earlier than that, so 1920s, and they followed them for many years. They actually followed them into their later years, 80s, 90s, et cetera. And they really said, well, what was it that predicted a meaningful and a meaningful and kind of really satisfactory life? And what they found is that social relationships were absolutely essential to that. But more importantly, they found is that it wasn't the quantity of social relationships, it was the quality. So it wasn't the number of Facebook friends, it was, do you have one or two people in your life that you know you can really rely on at any point in time? And it appears that that was one of the biggest predictors of positive health outcomes. So relationships and friendship satisfaction at 50 was the single biggest predictor of health and psychological memory at the age of 80. At retirement, those who replaced workmates with playmates appeared to have the best physical and mental health. And again, I think what came out of this research is that this was not necessarily, needing to even be with the person. And this is the reason I'm emphasizing this point is we're living in the midst of a pandemic. Just the psychological knowledge that there's somebody or one or two people that you have in your corner has very substantial positive effects on the brain and body. Any questions popping up? Any thoughts? Or just want to make sure? Yeah.
I've no doubt that loneliness has a harmful effect on one's health, but how do you quantify that to get to that 45% figure? I mean, it seems to me that loneliness is on a continuum, and where are you drawing the line?
Yeah, it's a great point. So I don't know the methods of this study, but I'm sure they measured people on like a 10-point scale. They did a host of interviews with these individuals over the course of their life. They probably had many ways of assessing, loneliness. I think the subjective, you could study loneliness in the brain, but really loneliness is a subjective experience, right? So, asking people how they feel is very important. But you're right. I mean, there's not some magical cutoff where you have a lonely person or a non-lonely person. So I'm sure they, in their analyses used the whole scale where, they could kind of capture the variety and nuances of different levels of loneliness based on their analyses. Very good question. Other thoughts, questions? Okay. So they've actually done some interesting research on loneliness and its effect on the immune system. And this is the work of the Kiecolt Glazers at the University at Ohio State University, in which they actually brought people into the laboratory and they just basically measured their self-reported loneliness. So how lonely did they actually feel? And then they were able to measure their states of inflammation in their body. So how, kind of what was the level of inflammation that they were actually expressing in their body. And what they found is that individuals who had lower self-reported social support actually had higher systemic inflammation in the periphery. And this is a interleukin-6, which is a pro-inflammatory cytokine, which is really involved in facilitating heightened levels of inflammation. So that makes sense. We probably know, I mean, if you've kind of following the first part of the talk, loneliness obviously is associated with inflammation. The next slide, though, is interesting, and if it's a little squeamish, so if you don't like seeing wounds, this is a very minor wound, but look away. But what they also did is they actually brought people in the laboratory, and what the Kiecolt Glazers did is they developed a very interesting technique of giving people blisters. So these are blisters that they were able to give people in the laboratory. And this is not a painful thing. They've done this research for many, many years. But what they do is they find that there are very interesting individual differences in how fast people respond from something like a blister, because healing from a blister is fundamentally an immunological response. And there's a lot of variability in how people respond to stressors. And what they found is that people who had high levels of social connectedness, and again, this doesn't mean tons of friends, but people who had one or two really kind of good confidants, were people who actually healed faster from their wounds, which is very interesting. So highlighting again the importance of social relationships in our health. Okay. The next stop on our roadmap to resilience. So we've talked about the importance of meditation, turning off the sympathetic response, letting go of that amygdala hijack, kind of engaging our rest and digest system. We talked the importance of social relationships. Social relationships. And the importance of having one or two people in your life that really matters. It actually turns out that there's no relationship between the number of Facebook friends somebody has and their sense of loneliness. So if somebody has 5,000 Facebook friends, it doesn't mean that they have a lower sense of loneliness than if somebody has 50 Facebook friends. What's really critical is just that one or two people. The third stop on our roadmap to resilience is exercise. So there's been growing evidence to suggest that exercise is probably the single best thing that you can do for your brain. And I rely on a colleague of mine who's a professor of neurobiology, one of my colleagues at Northwestern, a real outstanding neurobiologist. And she said to me in the past, if you want to save your brain, exercise. It's just remarkable the effect that exercise appears to have on our brains and on our bodies. Of course, we know it has a good effect on our bodies. The brain is simply an organ, and it appears that exercise has a robust effect on our brain. So let's take a tour of this. To examine the effect of exercise on our brain, I want to introduce us to a new brain system. We talked about this brain system, I think, briefly in our call in December. This is a brain region called the hippocampus. Anyone in the room know what the hippocampus is involved in? Memory, okay. So the hippocampus is critical to memory. It's very interesting that the hippocampus is not where memories are stored, which is intriguing. The hippocampus is a gateway to memory, meaning that memories, particularly what we call declarative memories, these are memories of things and places and people and events and facts, have to travel through the hippocampus, and then the actual memory long-term is stored throughout the entire cortex. But you could think of the hippocampus as like a way station that memories have to travel through in order to get consolidated. We know this is the case because there's been a very famous neurological patient called HM who had both of his hippocampi removed accidentally. Oh, actually, it was actually intentionally, but they didn't know how important the hippocampus was when they did this. He had a very serious form of epilepsy. And still to this day, a treatment for epilepsy is they'll go into the brain and try to remove the part of the brain that's creating the seizures. And so they removed all of HM's hippocampi on both sides of his brain, and HM never formed a new memory again in his life. He could learn new procedures, which is really interesting. So it suggests there's learning facts and learning how to do things involve different brain systems, but he never learned a new thing in his life. So you would walk in, say, hi, HM, have a conversation with him, come back 15 minutes later, he wouldn't recognize you. If you measured his skin response on his finger, his emotional brain remembered you. So he actually had an emotional response to you, but he couldn't recall cognitively and declaratively who you are. There's probably no brain region that's more affected by our environment than the hippocampus. The hippocampus is fundamentally probably the most plastic organ in the brain. Why? Because it has to be plastic because memory involves intersecting and interacting with the world all the time. If I was giving this conversation in the 1990s, I would suggest to you that we are born with a certain number of neurons, and the only thing that happens is neurons die. But we now know that the brain grows new neurons throughout the course of life. But it doesn't grow new neurons in all areas of the brain equally. It particularly grows new neurons in the hippocampus. And there's some evidence that the growth of new neurons in the hippocampus is really important for the formation of new memories. We know people who are depressed show reduced hippocampal neurogenesis. So not only do we grow new neurons, but our psychological state actually affects the kind of efficiency of those new neurons. And some evidence to suggest we're growing about 10,000 new neurons per day over the course of our life. And there's been a debate about whether it's just occurring in childhood or occurs over the course of life. There's growing evidence to suggest that hippocampal neurogenesis, as it's referred to, occurs over the course of our entire life. What's intriguing is that one of the best things you can do to facilitate hippocampal neurogenesis, which just means the growth of new neurons in the hippocampus, is exercise. And a lot of this has been done, research by Fred Gage. And it appears what happens is when you exercise, and it's particularly aerobic exercise that has its effect, aerobic exercise appears to release molecules that are really important for facilitating neurogenesis in the hippocampus. Aerobic exercise doesn't mean running marathons. It does actually, running marathons is not very good for your body because it creates a lot of inflammation. This is just getting your body up to a point where you're getting your heart rate going. With lifting weights doesn't appear to do it. It's really about aerobic exercise. What's intriguing is there's some evidence to suggest that you actually have to want to do it. Now, some of this work has been done in rodents, and it's hard to actually generalize to humans. But if you put a rodent in a scenario where it is forced to exercise and it doesn't want to, it doesn't have increased neurogenesis. Probably because the stress of not wanting to do it actually suppresses neurogenesis, because one of the big suppressors of neurogenesis is stress. Stress actually is associated with a reduction in the volume of the size of the hippocampus. And it actually has been shown to reduce neurogenesis in the hippocampus. So the point I want to make here is that if you want to use exercise as a way of strengthening your brain, find something you really want to do. Swimming, walking, running, whatever it is, biking, you got to want to do it, because if you don't want to do it, your brain's going to find it aversive, and it's actually not going to kind of keep it going, and it also may kind of reduce the positive effects. The next stop on our tour is the idea of discovery. I'll be brief on this point. This is the idea that the act of learning new things appears to be really important for maintaining the health of the brain. There's a researcher at Northwestern University where I'm at, whose name is Marcellum, who studies what are called superagers. These are people as they age show very little effects of the effective age on their brain. And they have high levels of memory, they have high biological tissue in the brain, lower, their brains are functioning quite well. And one of the things that Marcel highlights is the importance of kind of a continued curiosity of learning over the course of the lifespan to really facilitate kind of a healthy brain and engage the brain. So again, it appears that the area of the brain that's really affected by this consistent interest and desire to, the area of the brain that's very affected by a continued sense of discovery is the hippocampus. And there's a lot of research to suggest that learning actually enhances hippocampal neurogenesis. So putting yourself in environments that challenge you, that cause you to grow, that break habits, that get you actually thinking and inspired is appearing to be having a comparable effect on the brain as exercise. And there's evidence that enhancing and stimulating intellectual environments, and this doesn't have to be intellectual like reading philosophy. This is just being in an environment where people are stimulating you and you're learning new things and you're curious. I mean, for me, meditation is an act of curiosity. It keeps me learning about myself. So learning here is a very broadly defined, but that this sustained sense of curiosity is associated with enhanced neurogenesis, enhanced recovery from brain damage, an actual associated with a thicker cortex, heavier cortex, more neural connections, and actually larger neural connections. So a lot of this is the work of Elizabeth Gould. And she's done a lot of this work showing the great value of learning over the course of the lifespan. And the final thing I want to mention is, particularly in the context of Tibetan Buddhism and is the real value and importance of compassion and warmth in the roadmap to resiliency. I've had the privilege of spending some time in India recently with Tibetan monastics, and just the kind of complete different orientation to compassion, where compassion is always the priority, rather than kind of self-interest. And it's just it's infectious. I'm not saying that we need to become monastics, but there is evidence to suggest that a warm, nurturing, compassionate environment not only has a really positive effect on our own bodies and our own minds, but appears to have a really positive effect on the people in our world. And I just want to present to you a little bit of data on this topic as I close my comments for tonight. So there's evidence to suggest that one of the most powerful tools for resiliency that a parent can give to a child is a sense of warmth and nurturing parental style. And this is the work of Jean Brody at the University of Georgia. And so Jean and others have suggested that parenting involving high sensitivity, high emotional support, low conflict, i.e. warmth and compassion, really help protect children from the consequences of poverty. And there is growing evidence to suggest that if children grow up in an adverse situation, but they have a nurturant parent, maternal warmth, paternal warmth, etc., they seem to be very protected from the negative effects of poverty. I could have selected 15 different slides, but I'll show you one. So this is a study by Greg Miller, my colleague. This is a complex slide, I'll make it simple. So here what we have is early adversity. These are individuals with low adversity. These are individuals with very high adversity. What you can see is at low levels of adversity, maternal warmth here, which is kind of, you could kind of consider paternal, you could consider parental compassion, is not very important. I mean, I'm saying that a little glibly, but if you start to look at people who are living in high levels of adversity, if they have a parent who has high maternal nurturance, despite living in high states of adversity, and here adversity is defined as poverty, they're totally protected from the negative effects of the adversity on their brain and body. And this is looking at metabolic syndrome, but people see this for the brain, they see this in inflammation. By contrast, the worst case scenario is you're living in adversity without compassion. You're living in adversity in a situation where you don't have, the most important person in your life doesn't have compassion for you. And so this makes me think of some wonderful developments that I think are happening in the world to really facilitate parental warmth, parental compassion, parental nurturance. one of the people doing this work is in our own room this evening, Amy Roth, with developing the Turgar Parent Training Program. And Amy, do you want to say a brief word about this?
Sure, thank you. And of course, it's not just my parent program. We developed this curriculum with a woman named Kelly Petrie, who is a practice leader for Turgar in Madison, and then Susan Kaiser Greenland, who is a pioneer in bringing mindfulness practices to children and families. And so we developed this curriculum with under the guidance of Mingyur Rinpoche. He produced some videos for each of our modules. And we've run this program a couple of times now, and we're actually going to kick off a sitting group for parents that will be online starting on January 23rd. So you can reach out to me at amy@turgar.org if you're interested or know anyone who might be interested. But we call it Parenting with Awareness, Compassion, and Wisdom, and bring a lot of the joy of living concepts and approaches to parenting. So it's not telling people how to parent. You know, the idea is how are we relating to what comes up for us as parents? And it was really exciting listening to this talk and thinking about, you know, the inspiration for this program and how it touches on these pillars that you mentioned, and this idea of parents really need community. You know, it can be isolating to be a parent, especially in this culture that we have, where people aren't as willing to share the struggles and the troubles. And so this opportunity to be with other parents, especially parenting during COVID, it is such a challenge for so many reasons. And so anyway, I'm a social worker, and you know, I feel like the parent-child relationship is one of the most important, and it is where so much of the struggle that we then that lead to inflammation that we are trying to kind of unlearn through meditation and whatnot. That's where it occurs in the first place. And I think that if we can bring some of this awareness and compassion and wisdom, these practices, to parents as they're going through this, it's going to have a positive impact on the children, and of course let the parents enjoy being parents more.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. It's a wonderful program, and I'm excited about collaborating on it in ways of some of the research ways we discussed. Just a couple other programs that are really amazing on this topic: Richie Davidson's Kindness Curriculum, where he's bringing compassion training into the school system, and Geshe Lapsang, who's a former Tibetan monastic who's with the Dalai Lama in India and developed a social, emotional, and ethical learning program, is now a professor at Emory, and somebody I'm having the real pleasure of working with and looking at ways of increasing compassion in kids in order to kind of create these positive and long-term health outcomes. And having spent time recently in India with people who just, their life's priority is compassion, it's clearly infectious. So what I did tonight, just to close up, I had two goals for tonight. The first was to introduce to you some research on how stress actually affects our brains and bodies, how stress goes from out in the world and enters into our brain and affects our immune system, how the immune system can affect the brain, how the immune system and the brain can get stuck in this kind of spiral with each other and generate risk for mental and physical health problems. But I wanted to complement that with the roadmap to resilience, pulling on some research, some ideas from research to highlight 5 themes that really are being shown to be helpful in helping people develop adaptive responses to stress and navigate stressful situations. And so I'll just close by providing you with my contact information. Please email me if you have any questions or want to talk more about these ideas. And I think we have some time for sharing and question and answers if people want to chat.
Well, one thing I just wanted to say was, you know, thinking about these 5 things, and I love the way you laid it all out. I just feel as always, all the more fortunate to be involved with Turgar, and all the more grateful for our community here in Chicago. You know, meditation is as a whole organism anti-inflammatory, but it's, you know, and of course you can do it alone, but to do it in a community, you know, this idea of reducing isolation, of continuing discovery, you know, of regulating together, of kind of letting our nervous systems kind of bump around with each other, you know, cultivating warmth and compassion, of developing wholesome friendships. You know, we may not, right now we're not able to be together, but it's been a tremendous resource for me, and I'm sure the group would agree. Just to see that all of these things are are kind of encapsulated in our approach. And of course, even with exercise, Mingyur Rinpoche has encouraged us to exercise, and that, you can meditate while you're exercising, and so just to know that, like, kind of it's a buy one, get many, many free experience. So again, we would warmly welcome all of you to join us at our group anytime.
Yeah, I think I skipped over it. I actually had a little section on the social connection section that said, thank you, Turgar, in response to COVID, because it's been an incredible community. Absolutely the importance of a group is so important. And thank you, Amy, and all of the Turgar leaders, Jill and Kevin and Madeline and others who have been so helpful in keeping us together and going during this this very difficult time. It's been quite wonderful. So thank you. Other thoughts, questions, comments, or anything, disagree or agree, or throw out your own ideas? We can just chat for a while. I was able to turn off my slides, right? You're no longer seeing my slides. Good.
Robin, I have a question. Thanks for this. This was great. One of the things this brings up for me is, as someone that's been practicing for some time, kinds of the ups and downs of practice where you get dedicated for a while and things are going well, and then you sort of fall off the horse and you get back on. And so you kind of go in and out of your routines. And I was just wondering if that's a field of research that has been explored around, in addition to everything you just said, which is like, I took a picture of that slide, like, okay, cool. I've got my menu and there's 5 items on it and they're all tasty. Are there practices that help us, like, more at a meta level, like, stick with this or come back to these things in a way that helps renew us and keep us going?
Just great. It's a great question. And I should, I'll give you what I know. It doesn't mean that it's what I preach, or it's not what I do, because we all struggle with this. So I've become very interested in the psychology of habits. And I think a lot of the people that talk about changing behavior, they move away from having grand aspirations to having very attainable, very accessible habits. I mean, Mingyur Rinpoche talks about what many times in short. And what you want to do in this, according to this research, is create simple things that your brain can then start to feel as becoming habitual. Creating routines that facilitate the habit that you want to pursue. Creating an environment that actually makes it difficult to avoid the habit, engaging in the behavior. So, I mean, historically, when I've been trying to change my behavior, I've taken kind of like a strong will approach, which is I'm going to set a goal and I'm just going to do it. But I think the idea is creating an environment that is conducive to the habit, but then giving yourself success, right? I mean, there's this kind of hierarchy exposure in psychotherapy where you don't have people expose themselves to the most challenging trauma of their life right out of the gate. I also don't think we would expect of ourselves to, pursue the most grand goal right out of the gate. So I would say start small and create an environment that's conducive to giving you the success moments and making it very accessible and building up from there. I don't know if others in the group have ideas on ways that they can do this.
Well, Rinpoche talks about adding meditation to something you're already doing, like exactly what Robin said. So something as simple as meditating while you're brushing your teeth. So you can put a sticky note on your bathroom mirror that says meditate while you're brushing your teeth. So because he says, like, all you need for meditation is awareness, and the only obstacle to meditation is forgetting your awareness. So you can write little notes to yourself to get yourself into the habit, and then you just you feel the water on your hands, you notice the bristles on your teeth, the minty freshness, all those things that you can bring your awareness to, and you just know that you're doing it. I know that I'm brushing my teeth. And another thing that he says to do would be to start small, like he says, short times, many times, anywhere, anytime. But that, like, if you think, well, maybe I could meditate for 10 minutes, he would say then set the alarm, set your timer for 5 minutes. And if you want to continue, go ahead. But, to go ahead and kind of lowball yourself, kind of set it up for success.
Yeah, absolutely. Other questions or thoughts or comments on stress and resiliency? And
I have a question.
Yeah.
Early on, you said that early in development, set points in your brain are created that are basically your triggers for stress. Am I understanding that correctly? Is there any science or research in the science of neuroplasticity or even meditation that says that you can reset those stressful set points to maybe handle stress a little bit better in your adult life?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there is evidence that those early years are really important for establishing this kind of neuronal set point in the brain and immunological set point in the body, because that's when the kind of initial scaffolding is being established in the brain and the body. So these are what are called sensitive periods in developmental psychology. It appears that the very early years are very important for a sensitive period. Adolescence also appears to be an important sensitive period, primarily because of the kind of release of a lot of hormones that are interacting with the brain and body. So there is evidence that that the early stages of life and other sensitive periods really do matter. But I think it's also important to highlight the fact that plasticity and malleability and all these things occur throughout the course of life. So that means that if you're having stressful periods in middle age, that can also have negative effects, but that also means that you have more agency than we probably think we do to change our own biology and to change our own behaviors and et cetera. So there's really compelling evidence, and go back to that quote that Richie said, which is that there's no organ in the body that's more designed to change in response to experience than the brain. And the idea here is that no matter at what point you're in your life, you can develop the capacity to change your own brain and body. But I think it's not a Pollyanna-ish idea in the sense that it takes effort, right? So, if you think of the brain as an organ, 1 5-minute relaxation isn't going to change the habit of, 25, 45, 55, 75 years of life. It takes effort. It takes some motivation to change those habits, but that you really do see neuroplastic and neuroadaptive changes at any point in life. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah. Hi, Lisa.
Hi. I always find the correlations, or maybe they're not correlations, but this whole area of quantum physics and spooky objects at a distance, and how some of it seems associated with Asian traditions and meditation, how they kind of work together, like spooky objects at a distance, and the concept of if you observe something, then it changes it. And so to the point that you were just, this may be going off track, but to the point that you were just making, is there research also, because I know that's part of, Buddhist psychology also, is when you look at something or you observe it in your mind, it tends to change it. And whether or not that has like a resilient effect or like a longer term effect, if you're continually, looking at something from the past that has had a negative impact, but you're constantly observing that, does that have a effect on changing your actual, like, neuroplasticity?
Yeah, so a lot of great ideas there. First of all, I would say if you're interested in the intersection of Buddhism and maybe I get a little feedback. Maybe David, would you mind mute? Yeah, I don't know. There. If you're interested in the intersection of Buddhism and physics, so The Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra is a wonderful book. And he also wrote The Web of Life, which I think is very intriguing. So that's a quick plug on that. I'll kind of pivot a bit more to psychology rather than staying in the quantum world, because that can get kind of interesting. There's so much evidence that we do not see the world as it is, but we see the world as we create it. Now, you can think about that in a kind of existential way in quantum physics, or you can think about that with respect to the schemas and the filters and all of the different kind of views we have of the world. So the idea, and the study you were referring to by Schrodinger, is the idea that when you actually observe something, that actually affects the reality of it. And I think you can relate that to psychology, which is that we view the world through our own motivated reasoning. We view the world through our own kind of expectations and cognitions. And this actually affects the brain down to the level of kind of perception. Your expectation of something affects kind of your brain's response to it. Now that can be very kind of out there and what have you, but I think there's ways to make it a bit more concrete. We engage in these motivated cognitions. We really are motivated to see ourselves in a positive light. We're motivated to see ourselves in a light that's kind of supportive of ourselves. And in some respects, that's great. It's hugely adaptive. We know that, for example, people who are depressed have a hard time doing that. People who are depressed are more likely to kind of actually see the world actually as it is. It's called depressive realism. This is the work of Lauren Alloy in the 70s. So we have these kind of protective filters on, but obviously the kind of flip side of that is if we're engaging in protective filters all of the time, we're actually not, that also could be problematic. So, I kind of will take a Buddhist middle way perspective on this, which is that it's highly adaptive to kind of see ourselves in a positive light and kind of view ourselves in a positive light, but also not to delude ourselves to the point where we're just, kind of not able to make the changes in our lives that we need to, or kind of be honest with ourselves for personal growth. We could talk physics all night long, but I thought we'd probably go more the psychology within the
Thank
physics.
you. It's a great talk.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, loved it.
Maybe one last question, or Steve, yeah.
Is there any research on the relation? I'm thinking of recent events. Is there any research on the relationship between stress and racial bias?
Stress and racial bias, how so?
Wow.
So that people who are exposed to more stress might be more prone to racial bias.
I don't know. There's a lot of research on implicit biases and how, the brain engages in a lot of implicit biases. And I'm not sure whether they've looked at whether stress affects those implicit or explicit biases. Mm-hmm. I'll kind of flip the question a little bit differently, which is to say that there's compelling evidence that being racially discriminated against is hugely stressful for the body and brain. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the health disparities in outcome, for example, almost at every metric of life outcome, people who are racially discriminated against do worse. They live for shorter periods of time. They have higher rates of cardiometabolic health conditions and various things like that. And this is a topic that's become of a real priority for me. We have some new research looking at the effect of racial discrimination on the brain and the body, and strategies for helping people live in this kind of racial discriminatory world with which we reside. And so, but whether or not stress itself creates a greater likelihood for somebody to be, discriminate against somebody else, I don't know. I'm not sure of that research, but it's an important question. Any other question or closing comments? Okay, so we're at 8:30. So I would just, before Amy signs on, I would just like to say thank you so much. These conversations are so wonderful. I'm so grateful to the Turgor community. I'm so grateful for any students that I've had that have logged on tonight. Christina, I see you. Thank you. This is such a wonderful way to get together during a pandemic. And thank you for Amy for planting this idea in our minds. So this has been great. I don't know if you want to say anything to close, Amy.
Yeah, I would really just again like to thank you so much, Robin, for giving us this wonderful talk and sharing your knowledge with us. I would like to make one little tweak that the next talk will be on February 9th.
February 9th, yes.
That's okay. That's February 9th, so it's another Tuesday in 4 weeks. And that was the main thing. But, and of course, we would love to have you all join us again then and come and join us at any of our Sunday morning sitting groups from 9:30 to 11 a.m. And then we are also having we're hoping to invite Cortland to come and do some events, and kind of sadly this situation looks like it's going to continue, and so we'll have plenty more Zoom opportunities, so we'll do our best to make the most of it. So anyway, I would love to dedicate any merit or any benefit that comes from this to all sentient beings, and of course a deep bow of gratitude to Mingyur Rinpoche for his passion for neuroscience and for bringing us all together. And just all y'all be safe and stay well.